My wife's first love showed up at our door. And the first thing he said was that Maya should divorce me. I stared at him for 3 seconds. Then I glanced at my wife. I had only one thought. Had this guy walked into the wrong movie? More absurdly, he said he had waited 19 years for Maya. Because when Maya was 14, she had once told him, "When we grow up, I'll marry you." Great. He had remembered something she'd said at 14 all the way to the present. But the problem was, Maya was 33 now. She had a husband, 2 children, and a husband who fought her for the blankets every night. That husband was me. What sent an even colder chill down my back was that this man named William didn't merely know about Maya's childhood. He even knew roughly where I used to work and why my father-in-law had moved. He'd asked about nearly everything. That evening, he sat on my living room sofa, looked at my 2 sons, and then told me with complete seriousness, "Liam, do you know? I've been waiting 19 years for Maya." I asked him, "So what?" He looked at me. "So, you should give her back to me." I almost laughed out loud. Give her back? Is my wife some kind of object? But I didn't lose my temper right away, because I realized that this man seemed to genuinely believe that Maya had always been meant to belong to him. And the story begins 19 years ago. My name is Liam, and I'm 33 years old. I have a wife, 2 sons, and a job I want to quit every day, but would hate to give up if I actually did. My life was usually very simple. Go to work, come home, pick up the kids, and return home. Our biggest family conflict was nothing more than, who's washing the dishes today? So I always thought the biggest crisis of my life would be the mortgage. Until that night. I came home from work, and the moment I reached the door, I saw a pair of men's dress shoes. Black, gleaming, and obviously expensive. I stared at them for 3 seconds. My first thought, who's here? My second, why is it a man? My third, when did my wife meet a man who wears dress shoes like these? Of course, I'm a mature husband, so I didn't jump to conclusions. I simply took out my phone in silence. Click. I snapped a picture. Not because I was suspicious, mainly because it was good to have evidence. After all, a man's dignity sometimes begins with photographing a stranger's shoes. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. Peppa Pig was playing in the living room. Our 2 sons were sprawled across the sofa, laughing like a pair of idiots. But the first thing I noticed wasn't the children. It was the man sitting beside them. He looked to be around 34, wearing a dark jacket, his hair combed perfectly into place. He sat unnaturally straight, with his hands properly folded on his thighs. Judging by his appearance alone, I might even have thought he was a rather polite man. There was just one problem. Why was he sitting in my house? Maya came out of the kitchen, her hands still wet. When she saw me, she froze for a moment, then bent down and took out my slippers. "Liam, you're home?" I nodded, changed my shoes, and looked toward the sofa. "Who's this?" Maya hesitated noticeably. "William." "Who?" "My neighbor when I was little." I looked at William. He had already stood up. "Hello, Liam." He extended his hand. "My name is William." I had just reached out to shake his hand when his next words made me wonder whether I had come to the wrong house. "I came here today to ask you to divorce Maya." The living room fell silent for 3 seconds. Paige was still splashing in the puddle. My older son glanced back at me, then turned around to watch Paige again. Children really are slower than adults to sense danger. I stared at him for 3 seconds, then glanced at my wife. I had only one question in mind. Had this guy really turned himself into the male lead of a romance novel? "William," Maya said, her voice half a pitch higher than usual. "What exactly are you talking about?" "I mean every word. You want me to divorce my husband and go with you?" "Yes." Maya stared at him for a few seconds, laughing in disbelief. "Have you forgotten that I'm already married?" "I know. I have 2 children." "I know. I have a husband, a family, and a life of my own." "I know all that. Then what makes you think I'd leave with you?" William didn't answer. He only looked at her. The look in his eyes made me realize he wasn't here to joke around. He truly believed what he was saying. and he had been observing Maya for a long time, because his replies came too quickly, as though he had rehearsed these questions in his head countless times. I pulled out a chair and sat down. All right, since you're taking this so seriously, then let's have a serious conversation. William turned toward me, his hands resting properly on his knees. His cuffs were worn, but the clothes weren't cheap, and neither were his leather shoes. I noticed a faint white ring around the ring finger of his left hand, a mark left by a ring he had once worn and later removed. He knew my name, knew what I did for a living, knew I had 2 children, and even knew what time they got out of school. This man had done his homework before coming here. What exactly is the relationship between you and Maya? We grew up together. Then he began to speak. When Maya was 14, she was afraid of thunder, and he sat outside her house to keep her company. When she first learned to ride a bicycle, he held on from behind. When she fell, he pulled her back up. When someone bullied her, he stood up for her. Then she smiled and said, "When we grow up, I'll marry you." As he recounted these things, his tone was flat, as though he were reading from a script he had written long ago. But his gaze remained fixed on Maya, or more precisely on a spot somewhere behind her. He was looking at the 14-year-old Maya, not the 33-year-old woman standing before him. But what truly sent a chill down my spine was what he said next. "Liam, you used to work at Hongyuan Company, right? Your supervisor's surname was Zhou." Maya's face turned cold on the spot. "William, you investigated him?" I simply looked at him. Hongyuan Company, a supervisor surnamed Zhou. That really had been 10 years ago. But he had only mentioned the company name and the surname. He hadn't specified the company's line of business, nor how many years I had spent in that department. His information was limited, like a puzzle assembled only halfway. I leaned back in my chair. "Go on." William began recounting his 19 years. Maya moved away when he was 14. When he was 16, his father left. At 17, he dropped out of school and took whatever work he could find. Hauling bricks at construction sites, waiting tables in restaurants, delivering packages. At 20, he was injured at a construction site and broke his right hand, leaving him bedridden for 3 months. At 24, his grandmother died. His tone remained flat as he told it all, but he spoke a little faster, as though he were running out of time. At 26, he started a small business, and by 29 it had gradually become stable. Then he began looking for Maya. He asked the old neighbors, asked relatives, and, through her cousin, slowly traced her to this city. Once he found her, he didn't appear right away. He stood on a street corner and secretly watched her for several days. Watched her buy groceries, chat with the neighbors at the entrance to the residential complex, and cross the street holding the hands of her 2 children. "That was when I realized," William said, looking at Maya, "that you had truly grown up." He paused there, his Adam's apple bobbing. For a moment, I thought he was about to cry, but he held it back. "But I didn't leave. I waited 19 years for you. I couldn't just let it end like that." I stayed silent for a while after hearing him out. To be honest, I really did feel sorry for him. A child abandoned by his family, clinging to a childhood memory to endure the hardest years of his life. That was painful. But painful as it was, what did it have to do with my wife? "William, you waited 19 years for Maya. I believe that. But in all those 19 years, did you ever truly know her? Which university did she attend later? What work did she do? When did she get married? How nervous was she when she had her first child? Where were you during the hardest moments of her life?" William froze. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He couldn't answer a single one of those questions. He remembered that she was afraid of thunder, but he didn't know that what she feared most now was her children falling ill. He remembered her saying she would marry him, but he didn't know what she truly wanted once she grew up. He had waited for a person, yet he had no idea who she had become over those 19 years. He turned to Maya, as though clutching at his last lifeline. Tell him about what we were like when we were children." Maya was silent for a moment. "You helped me when we were kids. I remember you staying with me when I was afraid of thunder. And I remember you helping me up the first time I fell off my bicycle. William's eyes lit up. But that's not all I remember, Maya continued. I remember how you later sulked over something trivial. I remember you getting into a fight at 15 and being made to stand outside the classroom by the teacher. I remember how, after you left, we gradually lost touch. I remember the whole of you, not the 14-year-old me in your memory. The smile slowly faded from William's face. Maya looked at him. You say you waited 19 years for me, but those 19 years were your own choice. I never asked you to wait. I'm sorry you suffered, but I don't owe you a relationship. The living room was unnaturally quiet. William's Adam's apple bobbed again. He lowered his head and looked at his hands. Calloused hands with short, thick fingers and neatly clipped nails. His breathing grew a little heavier, as though he were fighting with himself. Then he spoke, his voice much lower than before. Maya, I haven't looked for anyone else in 19 years. I dated 2 women during that time, but every time it felt wrong. They weren't you. I always felt that you were still waiting for me, because when I left, I never properly said goodbye. Maya was silent for a long time. Then she said something that suddenly made my heart clench. When I was 14, I made all kinds of promises about the future. I said I would marry you. I also said that when I grew up, I'd live in a house with an attic, keep 3 cats, and even become someone who wouldn't have to work every day. Why do you remember only the part about marrying you? William froze. Because you only remembered the words you wanted to remember most, Maya said. Of everything I said when I was 14, about myself, about the future, about my own life, you didn't remember a single word. The only thing you remembered was the part that had to do with you. William opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through their messages. Look, you were the one who contacted me first. You said, long time no see. You said you lived in the east of the city. You said, let's keep in touch. I leaned over to take a look. Sure enough, Maya had sent it first. The date was more than 2 months ago. I turned to look at Maya, and her expression changed. She hadn't told me about it beforehand. William, Maya said, I contacted you because my cousin told me you'd been looking for me and that things weren't going well for you. I thought about it and decided I should at least reply. It didn't mean anything else. Then you could have chosen not to reply. Yes, I could have. But at the time, I thought that someone who had been searching for me for so many years shouldn't be met with nothing but cold silence. So I said, we'll keep in touch when I have time. It was only later, when you started messaging me every day, that I realized I'd chosen my words poorly. William held his phone and said nothing. Maya looked at him. You thought the words, let's keep in touch, meant there was hope. But to me, they were just a polite phrase. The moment you took them as a signal, you stopped listening to me. You started hearing only what you wanted to hear. William was silent for a long time. His shoulders sagged a little, his whole body looking as though a bone had been pulled from it. I noticed his fingers trembling slightly on his knee. Then he raised his head and looked at Maya, his eyes red. If I hadn't left 19 years ago, would you have married me? The weight of the question fell over the entire living room, leaving it silent. My older son finally tore some of his attention away from Peppa Pig and turned to look at us. I gestured for him to keep watching TV. Maya didn't answer right away. She thought for a long time, truly a very long time. Long enough for William's fingers to stop trembling. Long enough for me to feel my heartbeat counting out the seconds. Then she said, I don't know. William froze for a moment. Because back then, I didn't know who I would meet in the future, Maya said. I truly did want to marry you when I was 14. But that was me at 14, not the person I am now. You can't hold the 14-year-old me responsible for what the 33-year-old me does. William was silent for a long time. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his legs trembling slightly. He looked at me, then at Maya, and his gaze lingered on our 2 sons for 2 seconds. His lips moved, as though he still wanted to say something, but in the end, he swallowed the words. I'm sorry, he said. I've disturbed you. He walked to the door and bent down to put on his shoes. The black leather shoes were expensive, but I noticed that the edges of their soles were already badly worn. When he stood up, he didn't look back. The door closed. Maya leaned against the wall and let out a long breath. In my arms, her body trembled faintly, and it was a while before she spoke. My hands were freezing just now. I almost wanted to tell him, "Why don't you reconsider?" But I couldn't say it. I knew that. I held her tighter. "You said it very well." "Which part?" "You don't owe him a relationship." She was silent for a while. To be honest, at first I really wondered whether I ought to feel a little guilty. After all, he'd been through a lot. But later I came to understand that his suffering was real, but it wasn't my responsibility. That night, after both boys were asleep, I lay in bed, lost in thought. Maya turned over and asked me, "Are you angry?" "A little." She froze. "Didn't you say you believed me?" "Believe me, being upset with me and believing me are two different things. Of course I believe you. But when a man suddenly shows up at my house saying he's waited 19 years for my wife and is even planning to take my 2 children away with him, if I didn't feel anything at all, I might not be big-hearted. I might just have something wrong with my head." Maya was silent for a while, then reached out and took my hand. "I really did like him when I was 14. Her words left me stunned for a moment. I had expected her to say, "I was young and didn't know any better," or "It wasn't real love." She didn't. "I thought he was wonderful back then," she continued. "He was taller than all the boys in our class and would stand up to the people who bullied me. When he sat outside my house and kept me company while I hid from the thunderstorm, I truly believed he was someone who would protect me for the rest of my life." What happened next? Then he left. Not because he suddenly went away, we moved. At first, we still kept in touch through letters, but gradually the correspondence stopped. What I felt at 14 was real. But it's also true that I don't love him now. Just because someone loved a person when they were young doesn't mean they owe them a resolution for the rest of their life. I rolled over to face her. "Then who do you love now?" "Are you asking when you already know the answer?" "I want to hear it." She shot me a glare. "I love you. Happy now? Go to sleep." I didn't sleep. Neither did she. After a while, she whispered, "Liam, I did something wrong today." "What?" "I should have told you earlier that William contacted me. I didn't tell you after sending that text saying, 'Let's keep in touch when we have time.' I was wrong." I looked at her. "What were you thinking at the time?" "I thought it would all blow over soon, and there was no need to make you overthink it." "What about from now on?" "From now on, whoever from your past shows up, I'll tell you first." I reached out and ruffled her hair. "Then you passed today's test." She pinched me. The next afternoon, I went to pick up the kids. Maya walked beside me, moving faster than usual. When we reached the kindergarten entrance, Maya tugged at my sleeve. I followed her gaze across the street. William was standing there. He didn't come over, he was simply watching us. I watched him for a while. From where he was sitting, he had a perfect view of the kindergarten gate and the route the children took when they came out, yet he remained outside the security guard's line of sight. He had calculated it all. I walked over with Maya's hand in mine to pick up the children. The 2 boys ran out from their teacher. The older one threw himself into my arms, while the younger wrapped his arms around Maya's leg. We turned and headed back, with William following us for part of the way from across the street, always keeping the road between us. After we had gone about 50 meters, Maya stopped. She glanced back, then said to me, "You take the children and go ahead." "No, Liam." I said no. She glanced at me and didn't insist any further. We turned and walked back together, crossed the street, and stopped in front of William. He clearly hadn't expected us to come straight over and took half a step back. Maya spoke, her voice calm. "William, what exactly are you trying to do?" William looked at her. "I just wanted to see if you were doing well. Now you've seen that I'm doing very well. I have a husband, children, a job, and a home. I didn't mean anything by it. Whether you meant anything by it is irrelevant. What matters is that you're standing here today, across from my children's kindergarten. Do you think that's okay?" William's lips moved. "I was only watching from a distance." "You're watching from a distance today, and you'll still be watching from a distance tomorrow and the day after that. You think you're just looking, but to me, this isn't just looking. It's someone keeping tabs on my life. William, if you truly want me to be well, then you should respect my life. From today onward, don't show up near my children's school, don't ask about them, and don't follow me. If you do it again, I'll call the police. William's expression changed. His gaze shifted from me to Maya, then to the two children. The younger one had no idea what was going on and was busy picking at a button on my shirt. The older one glanced up at him, then lowered his eyes to his shoes. William remained silent for a long time. Then he nodded and turned away. This time he didn't look back. That evening I made 2 phone calls. The first was to the kindergarten, where I explained the situation to the teacher and told them not to let the children come into contact with any strangers, including anyone claiming to be an old friend. The second was to the property management office, asking them to keep an eye out for a male visitor wearing a dark jacket. Then I recorded the date, time, location, and details of what had happened in my phone's notes, and saved William's text messages. Maya watched me finish all this. Did you used to be a detective? No. I just don't like waiting until things get worse before dealing with them. She leaned closer. Why did you come with me today? Because he's coming after you, and you're my family now. When it comes to family, you shouldn't have to face it alone. She didn't say anything, burying her head in my shoulder. After a few seconds, I felt her shoulders trembling. I thought she was crying, but then she raised her head and glared at me. When did you learn to say things like that? Just now. Don't say things like that anymore. I can't handle it. Okay. No, saying it once in a while is fine. I smiled. A week later, my father-in-law called me. He rarely called me on his own. Usually, Maya would call, and I would chime in with a few words from beside her. He was silent for a while on the phone before asking me, "How much do you know about William?" "Dad, how did you know?" "He came to see me." My heart tightened. "When?" "Before you two first met. He tracked me down through an old neighbor and came to sit in my shop for 2 hours. He asked a lot about what Maya was like as a child." My father-in-law paused, then said, "Liam, there's something Maya doesn't know." My grip tightened around the phone. We didn't move back then entirely because of work. I lost money in my business during those years and ended up owing some debts. They weren't particularly large, but times were difficult, so we moved away. It happened many years ago, and I never told Maya. I didn't speak right away. Fragments in my mind began to fall into place. The clue William had mentioned earlier, the information in his statement, "You used to work at Hongyuan Company." It wasn't precise enough, as though he had heard it secondhand from someone else. What he actually knew was fragmented, pieced together bit by bit through old neighbors, relatives, and people he had known in the past. "Dad, I won't tell Maya about this, but don't let anyone casually inquire about our family's affairs again." My father-in-law was silent for a moment. "I understand." After hanging up, I placed my phone on the table. Maya poked her head out from the kitchen. "Who was it?" "Your dad. He asked about William." "How did he find out?" "His old neighbor told him." She furrowed her brow slightly but didn't press the matter. I didn't say anything more either. Some things that have already ended don't need to be torn open again. But I had learned something else. William thought he had uncovered everything about Maya, yet he didn't even know why she had left that city. The Maya he had always loved was the one in his memories, not the woman she was in reality. 3 days later, Maya's grandaunt called. I was sitting on the sofa at the time, and the moment I heard the sigh on the other end, I knew something was wrong. "Maya, William, that friend of yours from childhood, came to my house." Maya's expression changed. "What did he go to your house for?" "He said he deeply regrets everything and wants to see you one last time. Just once. He'll leave after he's said what he has to say." Aunt hesitated, then softened her voice. "Maya, he's rather pitiful too. Just see him once. It won't hurt." Maya gripped her phone and remained silent for a long time. The living room was very quiet. I watched her in profile. Her jaw was clenched tightly, and her fingers kept rubbing back and forth along the edge of the phone case. Then she spoke. "Aunt, I've refused him so many times already. If I see him again now just because you feel sorry for him, he won't think it's the last time. He'll only think there's still hope. I can sympathize with him, but sympathy isn't the same as giving in." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Aunt said only, "I just feel that he's suffered so much." "I know. That's why I'm not blaming you. But please don't pass along messages from him anymore. You're not helping him that way. You're only making it harder for him to let go." The call ended. Maya tossed her phone onto the sofa and sank into the cushions. I reached out and rubbed her head. She leaned against me and asked, "Am I being awful? Rejecting someone who's suffered so much? You simply didn't love him. What's wrong with that? I'd be the one crying if you actually left with him out of pity." "Why? My wife ran off, and I'd still have to raise 2 children by myself." She angrily smacked me once, but she was smiling. That night, lying in bed, I thought of something. William had contacted Maya's great-aunt, her father, the old neighbors, and her cousin. He had gone through her entire network of connections, trying to get close to her through them all. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act. He had been planning it for a long time. But there was something else I cared about more. When Maya answered her great-aunt's call, she didn't look at me. She didn't need to. She knew how she would handle it, and she knew how I would react. That kind of understanding had been built up over 5 ordinary years. It wasn't anything dramatic or earth-shaking. Just something that had slowly grown out of countless nights spent washing dishes together, arguing together, and covering the children with blankets together. Another week passed, and William sent a text. No threats, no pleading, just one line. "Liam, will you let me see Maya one last time? Just half an hour. I promise it'll be the last time." I stared at the screen for a long time, then handed the phone to Maya. She read it and was silent for a moment before saying, "Let him. Are you sure? At Starbucks. You'll be there too. Just half an hour." The following afternoon, we met at the Starbucks by the entrance to our neighborhood. I sat at the table beside them, while Maya sat across from William. When William arrived, he brought an envelope and placed it on the table. "Maya, I'm leaving town next week. A new job. A new city." "That's good." William looked at the untouched cup of coffee on the table. "I've been thinking a lot these past few days. You were right. I was waiting for the 14-year-old you, not the you are now. I have no idea what you've been through all these years." Maya didn't respond. "But I've figured out the question you asked me that day." "Which one?" "You ask why I only remembered the words marry you." William lowered his gaze to his hands. "Maybe it's because I had nothing back then. My father left, my mother didn't want me, and I lived with my grandmother. You were the only person who ever spoke to me about a future. Those words, marry you, weren't a joke to me. They were the only future I heard that year." Maya was quiet for a moment. "William, among all the things I said, some were about my own dreams and the life I wanted. You didn't remember any of those. You only remembered the one that had to do with you, because you needed that hope to keep going. But it wasn't because of me. It was because you were suffering so much back then." William remained silent for a long time. His fingers circled the rim of the coffee cup again and again before finally coming to a stop. "You're right." He stood up and pushed the envelope toward her. "There's a letter inside. It isn't for you now, it's for the you of 19 years from now. If you still want to open it, then open it. If you don't, forget it." Maya glanced at the envelope but made no move to take it. "William, I'm not taking it." William's hand froze in midair. "When you wrote that letter, what you had in mind was, maybe one day she'll still read it. But I can't give you that maybe. If I take it, you'll keep waiting. Even if you say you've let go, that letter will make you feel there's still a sliver of possibility." William's fingers tightened around the edge of the envelope, his knuckles turning white. He stood there with his hand outstretched, the envelope trembling slightly in midair. The entire Starbucks held only the 3 of us, and the gesture lasted for about 10 seconds. Then he pulled the envelope back, folded it twice, and put it in his pocket. "Maya," he said hoarsely, If one day things aren't going well for you, I won't be unhappy. William was momentarily stunned. Maya looked at him. I have a husband, children, and a home. You don't need to worry about whether I'm doing well. You should worry about yourself. William opened his mouth, but in the end he nodded. When he turned to leave, his steps were quick, and he didn't look back. The glass door closed behind him. He stood outside for 2 seconds, then walked away without turning his head. Maya watched me walk over, and I said, "That last line was especially good." "Which one?" "You should be worried about yourself." She rolled her eyes at me. "I was imitating you." "That's because I taught you well. Get lost." That night, after both boys were asleep, I sat on the balcony smoking. I had quit 2 years ago, but that night I bought a pack. I only smoked one. Maya came out and stood beside me, the wind blowing her hair against my arm. "Liam. Don't you have anything you want to ask me?" "About William." I thought for a moment. 2 questions. "Go ahead." "First, did you really like him when you were 14? "Yes, I did." "Second, if he hadn't shown up like this, if he had come back perfectly normally, if you'd simply happened to run into him by chance, would you have felt differently?" Maya thought for a moment. "Possibly." I glanced at her. "Because he's someone I used to know," she said. "Someone who was once kind to me. If he came back into my life in a normal way, I might genuinely be happy. I might want to have dinner with him and talk about how these years have been. But that wouldn't mean anything more. What would it mean then? It would mean I treasure what I experienced in the past. It wouldn't mean I'm willing to trade the life I have now for it." I stubbed out the cigarette. "Fine. Then I'll be honest with you too." I was a little annoyed by that "let's keep in touch" text. Maya smiled. "I know. You knew, and you still sent it?" At the time, I thought that after looking for me for so long, he deserved a response. But then he started messaging me every day, and I realized I'd made a mistake. It won't happen again. I'm taking back the point you gave me for giving him a chance to explain. "How much will you deduct?" "Eat hot pot for a month." "Is that a punishment or a reward?" She thought for a moment. "Both." That night, Maya stole the covers in her sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night and found that I had pulled the entire blanket over her. She was curled up in a ball, sleeping soundly. I watched her for a while, then tucked the blanket around her a little more tightly. The next morning, she asked whether I had slept poorly the night before. I told her she had stolen the covers. She said I was lying. It was clearly me who had covered her with the whole blanket. I said I must have been sleepwalking. She said, "You're more considerate when you're sleepwalking than when you're awake." My older son suddenly spoke up from beside us. "Dad, does Uncle William like Mom?" I paused. "He used to." "Then why doesn't Mommy like him?" I glanced at Maya, holding her coffee cup. She looked at me with a smile at the corners of her lips. "Because Mommy likes Daddy." "Daddy, are you feeling pretty pleased with yourself?" "A little," Maya said from the kitchen. "You too. Shut up and eat." William never appeared again. About a month later, I received a text message. It wasn't from William, but from an unfamiliar number. It was a forwarded message. One William had sent to that person. "Tell her I've arrived. Thank her for me." I stared at it for a long time without replying. Later, Maya found a yellowed sheet of paper in the drawer. The agreement we had written as a couple before we got married. Back then, we had just rented that little house. We had no money, and our wedding had been far from lavish. One night, we suddenly felt certain that we would argue in the future, so we sat on the bed and very seriously wrote down 6 rules. Share passwords. Inform each other if someone of the opposite sex intrudes into our family. Don't conceal having meals alone with someone of the opposite sex. If an ex reappears, take the initiative to explain. Don't delete chat records out of fear of an argument. If the agreement is violated over an extended period, we may reconsider the marriage. Maya looked at the paper and smiled. We were really serious back then. Do you still abide by it? Of course. But the 6th clause can be changed. Whoever breaks the agreement has to treat the other person to hot pot for a month. Have you been wanting to eat hot pot all along? None of your business. A few days later, she dug out that piece of paper again and added a few words beneath the sixth clause. I leaned over to see. She had written, supplementary clause. If someone suddenly appears and asks us to get divorced, we go home together. I stared at the line without saying a word. Maya folded the paper and put it back in the drawer. This line was added specifically for you. Why specifically for me? Because that day on the balcony, you asked me if things would have been different if William had shown up in a normal way. When you asked that, there wasn't much expression on your face, but you smoked. You'd quit smoking 2 years ago. I said nothing. She reached out and patted my cheek. You're pretty amusing when you're jealous. I'm not jealous. Who smoked that cigarette of yours? I drew it for you. She walked away with a smile. That evening we had hot pot. Halfway through the meal, Maya suddenly put down her chopsticks and looked at me. Liam. If you hadn't calmly listened to William until he finished and had instead thrown him out right away, I might have panicked even more. Why? Because that would have meant you were afraid. Afraid that there was something between him and me that you couldn't control. But you listened to everything he had to say, and then you asked me what was going on. That felt different. I swished a slice of tripe through the hot pot. Of course I had to let him finish. You made him wait 19 years. He deserved to have his say. Keep pretending. What am I pretending? She looked at me. You're not worried because you already know how this will turn out. I was silent for 2 seconds. That's right. She smiled. On the drive home that night, the 2 boys fell asleep in the back seat. Maya sat by the window, the streetlights sweeping across her face in intervals. I was driving when a thought suddenly came to me. William had waited 19 years, and in the end, he finally learned to let go. But what about me? I didn't have to wait, because the person I was waiting for was home every day. Perhaps that was what marriage was. Not that no one had ever come along, not that there were no temptations, and not that you would never encounter trouble. It was that no matter what happened outside, in the end you knew where you belonged. I glanced back at the rear seat. Maya had fallen asleep with her head tilted to one side, a smear of red hot pot oil still clinging to the corner of her mouth. Our 2 sons were squeezed together, the older one resting his feet on the younger one's legs. I stopped at a red light and reached over to wipe the oil from the corner of her mouth. She didn't wake. The light in the living room was still on when we got home. I carried our younger son upstairs, with Maya following behind, carrying the older one. The only sounds in the stairwell were our footsteps and the children's steady breathing. This was the life I wanted. My wife here, my children here, the lights on, and dinner still warm. As for the man who waited 19 years, I hope he can find his home in another city, too.